welcome to this first panel that is focused on integrating the social dimension into the adaptation planning. So the planning phase is the core topic for us. And in particular from those two angles, how to engage vulnerable groups within vulnerabilities assessments and how to select adaptation options that leave no one behind. I would like to ask from the panelists that what would you say that are the fundamental building blocks to integrate this social dimension in the adaptation planning processes? And in this context, we have this report from this Stockholm Institute. I think it has been crafted together with international partners. Frida, would you shed light on this report and the issues that are very, very comprehensively, let's say, crafted in that report? What are the issues on planning process?
I think every one of us working with justice in this context knows that it's quite a heavy task to really understand what are the core issues. But we're working with two main components. First, to start with, recognizing that one part is the uneven burdens of climate change impact. So how will different groups, right, be affected differently? And then there's also the adaptation action in itself and how that might have benefits for certain groups and not others. So really trying to actively working with adaptation in a way that supports the most vulnerable and avoid maladaptation, of course. Where like the main aspect of justice that we try to at least include is distribution justice, which has often been the one that we focus on, procedural aspects, so who gets heard and how, but also now increasingly noticing that recognition justice, so like what do we value basically, and working with underlying structures of how distributional and procedural justice have not been, are issues to take into account. So those three main aspects.
When we developed our sustainable energy and climate action plan, and I think that one of the core issues exactly was how we can measure this and how we can balance different targets for each vulnerable group. When we were developing sustainable energy and climate action plan, we tried to engage all of the groups within the city, and it was, I think, a little bit easier for us that we have city neighborhood coordination centers. So basically, the city is separated in different neighborhoods. For each of the neighborhood, we have responsible coordinator or which knows better the practical insights of each of the neighborhood and the targets what we need to achieve there. And this was a very good platform from which we can build our targets for the sustainable energy climate action plans and how we can assess these.
Bratislava, our current action plan for climate change adaptation has already reached its lifetime, and currently this year we picked up work on a new CCAP. So it will be our first CCAP where we will join adaptation and mitigation for climate change. And currently we're in the phase of starting the working groups, inviting people into different working groups and different topics. Colleagues of mine, they created a manual for public participation, whether it is a development project or it's a strategic document, which also carries an analysis on the different communities we have and the different things one needs to be aware of when designing a participatory process with different communities and with reflecting the different problems they face. So it's and in terms of climate change, we of course think about these communities in first place as the most vulnerable ones. In terms of vulnerability assessments, we think especially in terms of vulnerable population, of course, the elderly people, the people whose health isn't that great, people that rely on a heavy basis on different social or healthcare facilities, and but also people that are coming here to work as seasonal workers, people that stay in different accommodation facilities of the city that basically don't have the financial means, etc., to support themselves. Some groups are more vulnerable to some climate change impacts, and others are not as much. So that would be the first point where we distinguish, and we start to define more who is the vulnerable group, or who are the vulnerable communities. And another interesting point in the work we are doing, we start by one community and working with them and talking to them. Then we learned that we also need to talk to other communities that we haven't thought in the beginning of the process.
If you did identify or anticipate positive or negative social effects from these measures that you were planning, I think we have one example also in the report is briefly described, like nature-based solutions in the park, and then the house prices started to increase and gentrification happened, and access to the housing for, let's say, lower income families became difficult. Just to give one example.
For example, we are in Bratislava. We just completed in 3 years a challenge called 10,000 trees, and Bratislava has been accelerating in green adaptation measures and revitalizing public space, etc. And the thing is that with the climate change accelerating, and colleagues of mine, they are, the way they are designing these projects, they are already thinking about more, for example, heat and drought resilient species that they use in those projects. But still, the maintenance cost and the cost for care for green measures is also increasing. So that is like the other side of the coin. When you implement green measures, of course they are wonderful, and they are the ones we prefer because of the many benefits they provide us, but they are also becoming very increasingly costly.
For us, I think that all the green measures, it's much cheaper if we compare that our sewer water and rainwater collection system is outdated, and the investment costs, what is needed to completely reconstruct whole the system, it's an enormous amount, and it's much easier also that we can rapidly increase the green zones and everything, how we can collect rainwater within the city.
You have really unintended effects, right? Or maybe you didn't. And sometimes it's really that just born out of not understanding, and sometimes sometimes you're wondering, because it's really about also having a voice, right? So in planning, for example, which groups are stronger when it comes to advocating for their needs and their values. I think there's also a real point of addressing that there's a conflict. Well, between groups, but also between the public and the private realm. So, like property prices, for example, and who owns land, and who is bearing the brunt of these investments, etc. As well as who has the ability to pay. And then there's also the kind of short-term and the long-term perspective, where there might be investments that come early on, but that might have passive houses or energy, especially in the energy realm, where you have quite a lot of investment costs in the very beginning, but then in the long run you actually have energy savings, for example, or economic savings. But then only certain groups can actually bear those initial economic not shocks, but increases.
And now with the second panel, we will focus, as I said, on the implementation of the just resilient plans.
I work in the city of Zagreb in the city office of economics, sustainable development and strategic planning. And my office is the lead local partner in the ProGREC project, which is the project that it's financed under the Horizon 2020 program. And Zagreb is one of the front-runner cities. The topic of the project is introducing, it's actually revitalizing post-industrial areas in cities with green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. We came to the solution of implementing, among other activities, implementing a therapeutic garden in the easternmost suburb of Sesvete in Zagreb. We took use of the city government by sending we sent a letter to the city office of social services and asked them about the potential users of the therapy garden in this area of the city. So we got addresses and contacts of several institutions that help or work with children and grown-ups with disabilities. So we gathered them in a workshop, and using their input, we sort of transferred that into a program and gave it to the designer, to the landscape architect who designed the garden in a way that its use is optimal. The garden is it is planned in three sections, but one of the section is raised garden beds where the users actually plant vegetables and tend to them. So the users needed to organize everyday use. So if it's like really hot, somebody has to come and to take care of the gardens. The users, especially the parents of children with special needs, have been really super happy with the garden and with this opportunity to spend time outdoors in an area which is adapted to their needs.
If you want a metaphor, we were talking about changing the conversation in this. The metaphor is like a seed bomb. So trying to bring a perspective of social science and particularly on justice within, let's say, epistemic community, a knowledge community, which is mainly made of engineers, chemists, so that's more, who tend to have a more technocratic and let's say, take on how environmental intervention should be done. You have to identify, so what is, you have to identify the leaders of communities, see which are their concrete issues and try to address them in a way that you actually learn to speak their language. Yeah. In research-wise, talking about interdisciplinarity it is a big word, but in practice, what is important is to have groups that are mixed and also from the beginning. So instead of, so it is important to increase the level of interdisciplinarity from within, to have social scientists lead projects, because it's more difficult, from what I found, for hard science to open up to the ideas of social scientists than the other way around.
The issue is that adaptation to climate change is a pressure. We have to do something. We have to implement green measure, soft measure, and blue measure, and less gray measure in our territory. But we have also to pass the message from the different perspective of the people that adaptation need time. And so the message to the people has to be really, really clear to engage them during the process. And not only during the starting phase of the process, but during all the phases of the project, because otherwise they could not absolutely understand the benefit. Because the benefit of the implemented measure are seen by the people when the measure is completed. To make a new green space that is not only green space, that has a multiple function and multiple benefit. Some of these benefits are measurable, some other are not so clear measurable for the people because they are intangible benefit. And when we talk about the value of adaptation for the people, for the economic tissue, and for the political asset of a city, we have to look at different benefit, different vulnerability for different people. Not all the NDS are self-sustainable. And also you have to look at the social acceptance of an area that will change completely. Greening is fantastic on one hand, but it takes also a long period to be completely grow. Because when you look at a project, you look at the rendering, and so you look at the expectation, the final results. But again, the social acceptance is essential to really understand and to love that solution.